All right, welcome to The Torch. My name is John Hancock. I'm excited to have my friend Carl Scott here. He's an independent scholar and with a Ph.D. in political science from Fordham University. And he is a member of the St. John's Anglican Church in Utah. And he also leads the Provo Great Books Club. Carl is the author of at least one book that I know of, Totalitarianism on Screen, The Art and Politics of the Lives of Others, and he has many published articles, including articles in First Things, Law and Liberty, National Affairs, and so forth. One of his best articles, and one of my favorites, is his article, Five Conceptions of American Liberty. Carl also publishes frequently on the Postmodern Conservative Substack, and I will provide links to all of these sources below. And Carl is one of my smartest and most well-read friends, and I hope that we will have many conversations on The Torch. I met Carl soon after completing my master's degree in political philosophy and American politics at Hillsdale College, and he invited me to participate in the Provo Great Books Club more than 5 years ago. And so in our first conversation, I'd like to focus on the Provo Great Books Club and ask Carl to help explain what it is, what we do, and why we do it. So is there anything else you'd like to add to my introduction or correct in the introduction?
No. The Substack is Postmodern Conservative, and I do write under the author name of Carl Eric Scott. So that's what you'll see my articles published under.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So, what is the Provo Great Books Club?
Okay, so we meet once a week, and for those of you who are in the area, it's Wednesdays 7 to 9. We do have a few members who join us via Zoom, but we generally meet at someone's home, and we are a book club, but we're discussing what are known as the great books, which I'm sure we'll be kind of talking about what those are today. But I mean, just a couple examples. We read a Dostoevsky novel recently called The Idiot. We read Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey. We read a history by Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War. So we kind of alternate between works of literature, philosophy, political philosophy, history. And again, these are books from lists that are pretty well established for what people consider to be the great books. There's a distinction between the great books and the classics, but what else should I say about the group?
Well, how did you? I mean,
How to get going?
yeah, how did it get going?
Yeah.
How'd you come up with it?
Well, so I was working at Utah Valley University, UVU, and my teaching there was all kind of focused on American constitutionalism. So I did a lot of stuff on the American founding, kind of the Constitutional Convention, and then quite a bit of work on constitutional law. And I love that stuff, but it wasn't my first love, and I was getting a little restless for my first love, which was really the great books. Way back, I was a history grad, did some secondary teaching, and one time when I was looking in education school, we were taught different theories of education, and I can't even remember what the other ones were, but one of them was called perennialism, and they talked about this guy, Mortimer Adler.
Okay.
And he had the crazy idea of thinking that the purpose of education, or you should structure your theory of education around the idea that education's purpose is to learn the truth. And that just kind of seemed obvious to me, right?
Yeah, imagine that.
Of course, that's really what it is. But all these other theories, it'd be like, condition yourself to society, stuff like that. I can't remember what the other ones were. So I picked up a book. Actually, I brought it with me today. Mortimer Adler's Reforming Education. Here it is. It's an older book. I think probably the 90s.
Okay.
I think he published it probably in response to Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind.
Oh, interesting.
Kind of saying, well, you're talking about the great books, Alan Bloom, but I was here first
Oh,
promoting this stuff.
oh, the subtitle is the opening of the
The
American
opening
Mind.
of the American Mind. It's really only a collection of essays, but they're very good essays, and it really got me excited about this idea of an education rooted in the great books, a kind of classical liberal education. And I pursued a master's degree at St. John's College, Santa Fe, New Mexico. That's one of two St. John's College campuses. I wish they had established more. The other one, the original one, is in Annapolis, Maryland, and these are, I sometimes refer to them as the great books only schools, because there's no majors. So the undergraduates all read. They don't get like oh, you're a major in sociology. No, they read the same books, which is really cool because
Yeah.
they get to discuss them together.
That's great.
So they get kind of I think a BA in liberal arts, they call it. I did something called their Graduate Institute degree, which you can do in 2 years or 1.5. So it's a master's degree, and you get kind of a sampled version of the full St. John's curriculum. The actual undergrads do a lot more work in languages and math and science. So you kind of skip that most of that part in the Graduate Institute program. So suffice it to say, that whole influence I was captivated by. I loved my time at St. John's. I actually did a job as tutor there for a bit. Tutor at St. John's is kind of the equivalent of a professor. But then they kind of said, well, if you want to keep doing this, you really do need a Ph.D. So I went off to Fordham University, a Catholic university on the East Coast, New York City, and got my Ph.D. in political science. And that was in many ways because I thought that people in the particular area of political science called political philosophy, were more serious about studying the great books. I just saw the way they handled authors that I cared a lot about, like Plato and Aristotle, and it just seemed more thorough. These were mostly scholars that were Straussian, or as I prefer to say, Strauss influenced.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my educational background.
Okay.
And I was just, I had some students that I had good interactions with at UVU. And I said, we'd talk about, oh, you haven't read this, oh, you haven't read that, oh, you really should. And so one thing led to another. And, there's a couple students there who I knew would be into it and who already were reading serious things themselves.
Yeah.
One of those was a student named Sam Corey.
Yeah.
And so we publicized it mainly with BYU students and UVU students, and got an initial group going, and we've been going ever since.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So before Mortimer Adler, you naturally had the idea in your mind that the purpose of education is to seek truth and find truth. And that should have seemed obvious, but it wasn't, in a sense, because you still had to stumble upon Adler. And then, so Adler led you closer to, he basically articulated what you had already thought was the purpose of education. And so he brought you to, before Adler, had you been reading the great books? Were you interested in the great books, or was...
To a degree.
Yeah.
I was very serious about being a history undergraduate and learning how to be a good history teacher. That was my initial career plan.
Yeah.
But the other key thing about myself, I guess, was that I was, an evangelical Christian. I guess I would still accept that tag. Involved in a student group called InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and that group did encourage its students to read pretty thoughtful books going into theological issues.
Yeah.
And so if you read church history or theology, or just kind of a Christian apologetics book, you inevitably kind of come up against these philosophical questions, or someone's going to be talking about, well, that fits with what Aristotle says or Plato says, and so you naturally develop a thirst for those authors. I mean, I think I had a couple philosophy courses. I had, I think freshman year we did Plato's Republic. It was I think a horrible translation, but I had a good, sincere philosophy teacher, and I really loved it. I kind of thought, oh, this is great, A lot of the rest of the college wasn't that great, but that was good stuff. So I think, particularly being from a Christian background, any serious religious background, I mean, this whole idea of the truth is pretty paramount.
Yeah.
And you're also, I mean, if you're from a religious background that emphasizes, evangelism, sharing your faith, daring someone to make that move of converting from a stance of no faith or maybe another faith to another, then you got to be pretty serious about conversation, about freedom of speech, about ideas.
Right. But St. John's was another level of being able to immerse yourself in these great books, and maybe another level of helping you to explore the truth in not in religious as well as political and philosophical.
Yeah, and the other thing I guess is I was already fairly political, and kind of it was a little unusual at the time. I think it's become more common, but I was a kind of conservative theologically conservative evangelical, but I was in these like kind of left-wing groups, it was Democratic Socialists of America. They were a little bit more respectable in those days than most of the chapters are these days, at least for my present more conservative opinion. So I was always thinking, one thing that was a huge impact on me was debate club in high school.
Okay.
So that was my favorite thing in high school, was debate club.
Okay.
And so I was already I guess even before the religious stuff or the focus on religion that got pretty strong in my college years, I was already interested in politics, in argument. So that's part of the explanation.
Okay. And so from St. John's to Fordham to UVU to the Provo Great Books Club, the Provo Great Books Club is how it's organized is in a way that's similar to the St. John's curriculum. Can you kind of explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, I should have said that already. Yeah, it's essentially a conversation, an informal conversation, a little bit like what we've got going on right now, a seminar, right? So it's not a lecture, and we read the book. We'll read, let's say we'll read 2 books of Plato's Republic, or usually with like a Shakespeare play, you just do the whole thing for one session. And, then it's kind of opened up, there's an opening question maybe that is designed to raise a point that I feel is central, and just kind of to get the conversation going.
Okay.
But it can pretty much go from there, and really anything people want to bring to the table is fair game. And so we don't have a lot of like big time disagreements or debates, but we could. There's no particular reason why that couldn't happen more often in our book club or in any other book club that people establish, as long as you've got some good ground rules for conducting conversation, listening to one another. How do you disagree, that kind of thing.
So what are some ground rules that have been helpful in the Great Books Club?
Well, I guess the biggest one is, and this is based on the assumption that these books really are great and that there's really potential wisdom in any one of them, that our primary task is to try to figure out, what are the main things the author's saying. I mean, what is Plato doing in, let's say, the dialogue, the Meno? What are the primary lessons he wants us to take away? What are maybe the special lessons that he's packed in there for readers that are more careful?
Mm-hmm.
What are the kind of paradoxes that are really left unsolved, that he believes an honest student would see are there?
Mm-hmm.
That's really what we're about. So it's really not, we're not trying to do things like, contextualizing Shakespeare today. What do we
Mm-hmm.
think about Shakespeare and the way he presents women today?
Uh-huh.
Or, we're not trying to do something like a specialist, reading of, say, Livy. Like when we
Yeah.
read Livy, we're not that concerned with how much of this is accurate. I mean, there's all these specialized historian, classicist debates about how much of that stuff is myth or kind of,
Uh-huh.
the special story of what happened according to one class that has a political edge. I mean, and I'm not, it's not to say that those kinds of debates or investigations aren't worthwhile. You you can read a good academic paper on, say, what did Milton learn from such and such author in the past.
Mm-hmm.
How was he influenced by the Psalms? How was he influenced by the epic tradition?
Uh-huh.
Those kinds of topics could come up in our discussion, but we try to frame things more on the bigger questions. Like with a literary work, we're kind of, well, what are the main effects that we're being subjected to? Who are the
Uh-huh.
characters that we're rooting for? What are we meant to think about the plot? What do we think about the plot?
Yeah.
Right? And so it's always open for someone to say, Milton is really suggesting this with this character, and I'm not happy about that because I think that his presuppositions are wrong.
Uh-huh.
But that is a step that should be taken in most cases after you've done some careful work of, well, what is this particular author saying or not saying?
Right. So yeah, you mentioned Straussians before, and we should probably mention a little bit about that, about reading to actually understand the author as he understood himself. But as you're talking about these things, I start to wonder, well, who can participate in the Provo Great Books Club, and how is it different from a regular book club? Because it is different.
Yeah, it is different. So, I mean, the main difference is that we have a kind of preset canon that there's loose agreement about. And on the edges of that canon, there's more room for, what belongs in the list of great books or not.
Right.
So, like, I don't know, most people would agree, for example, that in American literature, Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain is a great book.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I think he wrote like a sequel to Tom Sawyer. I don't even know the title of it.
Uh-huh.
But in other words, he did write some books that are more minor. Just because an author wrote a great book, do we consider all of his books great?
Yeah.
Not entirely clear. We just finished reading Hesiod, a kind of classical source for Greek mythology. There's some lists of the great books it won't be on there. It's actually on there quite a bit, but it, in some cases, won't be.
Mm-hmm.
We've read one contemporary book by, well, yeah, it's basically contemporary because it only came out recently, by Solzhenitsyn, a segment of his Red Wheel series.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's no doubt at all that several of Solzhenitsyn's works will wind up being in the canon of great books, particularly the Gulag book. But the particular book we read, is a section of what's called March 1917. Is that going to wind up? It's hard to say, right? So those are some examples of things that might be on the edge
Okay.
of the of the canon of great books. And I'm sorry, I'm losing a little bit of sight of
Oh, well,
your
no,
question.
no, I want to get to the one of the main questions is what is a great book? What
Right, the
constitutes?
criteria.
Yeah, how do we decide what a great book is? But also, we have a really interesting group of people
Right.
that has joined us. So can anyone join this?
Yeah, well, I've never really thought about that.
Yeah.
I have actually, I'm a substitute teacher,
Mm.
and I have actually told high schoolers, well, we've never had a high school member, but we're not close to it in
Uh-huh.
theory,
Yeah.
if the parent gave permission, I guess I'd be a little nervous about a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old, but
Yeah.
um, I don't see why not, and
Mm.
certainly that would go up to. So I think the answer is yes. Is there a possibility that someone could behave in a way that we would have to invite them to leave?
Yeah.
Yes. But we're pretty radically open. We've had members. I mean, it's the Provo Great Books Club, so we're in Provo. So obviously, there's a lot of members like yourself that are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Yeah.
I'm Anglican. We've had atheist members. At one point, we learned a little belatedly we had a communist member.
Oh yeah, your Marxist friends.
Yeah. So we're. I mean, it can be a little difficult sometimes, particularly with certain texts. But we tend to work through it. We tend to be able to. And this is maybe a hard point. It requires some real prudence on the part of the main members and the main facilitator.
Mm-hmm.
But we've had success, I think, in raising tough topics and being able to discuss them from different backgrounds in a way that's been civil and
I think
appropriate.
So. Yeah, we've definitely had some eclectic members, some different backgrounds, and we've had some disagreements and discussions that, but it's always been respectful, and I feel like for the most part we always come out at the end of a session having gained something and maybe learn something definitely about what the author intended and I mean, members are some members will choose to be silent the entire session, or maybe only raise a couple points. Mm-hmm.
Others talk a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
I regard myself as the facilitator, the chief facilitator,
mm-hmm.
but I do ask other members to do that, take on that role sometimes, or to do the opening question.
Mm-hmm.
It's really quite open to the person what they want to get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's every conversation has its own kind of dynamics. I will say this, that even for myself, who has a lot of kind of academic experience under my belt, the fact that that you're going to be discussing with some friends of yours such and such a book, I mean, it really does encourage you, hold you accountable in a good way to get it done, right?
Yeah.
And to do it in a way that's thoughtful.
Right.
It's very easy when you're on your own to set high expectations. Oh, I'm going to read 10 Shakespeare plays this summer.
Mm-hmm.
These books that we read can be difficult. A Shakespeare play, reading on your own. I mean, it's maybe easier with some of the media tools that we have now. You can watch a performance, or let's do something really hard. One of the harder things we ever did, we read a shorter work by Immanuel Kant, the philosopher.
Yeah, I was gonna say maybe Hegel or Kant.
Hegel, yeah. I mean, it's tough stuff. I mean, there will be passages where you'll read it 3 times and you still don't understand it. And so it's very helpful to have the meeting time, and for me it tends to bring more out in my personal study. And then almost every single time we meet afterward, I'm kind of like, oh, okay, there's some things I didn't see. And
Yeah, And it, yeah, like you said, it helps you prepare, and you need to be thinking about questions and maybe how other people will respond, and also, and I appreciate when you start. I don't mind if you talk more if you've spent a lot of time with a particular work, especially like if we're reading Plato or Tocqueville or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. I don't mind if you talk more than someone who's never read one of those books before, but still, I think it's great that you field people's ideas and questions, and um, but still, let's just get back to the question for a minute of, we've mentioned many of these great books, but what is it precisely that makes a book a great book and not just a good book?
Yeah, I think the main criteria that have been mentioned by people is it's a book that, kind of the popularity it wins the popularity contest over time,
Uh-huh.
right? It may not be the best seller now, but generations upon generations of people turn to the book.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think the other criteria is that it really addresses in some significant ways kind of perennial human questions, kind of meaning of life type
Yeah.
questions. But I mean, these can be more specific, like what constitutes beauty in a work of art.
Uh-huh.
Not necessarily something you're thinking about every day, but it does wind up being important,
Yeah.
and a number of works will address it. Another criteria would be that it is worth reading multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
There are some books that really can hit you in a major way, first time read, or there could be a book that's perfect for 2023,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not going to stand the test of time.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to seem less compelling or less important for people to explore down the line.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was thinking today about that. I think
Yeah.
some books that we get assigned in high school have a little bit of this flavor,
Yeah.
like Catcher in the Rye.
Okay.
It's a perfect
That's
book to read
that's
if you're
fun. I
if
enjoyed
you're a
it.
16-year-old and you're
Yeah.
starting to get a little rebellious. But it's I don't I have not read it since high school, so maybe
Uh-huh.
I'm wrong. Maybe if
Yeah.
I turn back to it, there would be, um, but and it's not just that you yourself have an inclination to turn back to the book. There's kind of a pull almost in the broader culture,
Yeah.
this popularity contest over time to return to it.
Okay.
Maybe the final criteria would just be that these are books that tend to get built upon. So
Mm-hmm.
other great books or books that aspire to be great will refer back to the great books.
Right.
So it's true there are like some hidden gems of 19th century literature,
Uh-huh.
and for example, for a long time, I think a good 40, 50 years, Melville's Moby Dick was neglected.
Oh, interesting.
Or there's a famous poet, John Donne, whose poems were neglected
Oh.
for centuries. So there's
Yeah.
trends that come and go, um, and so it's possible for a book that we're not really regarding as great now, in the future it would be regarded. Maybe there's some 19th century author that
Mm-hmm.
has got something great that just a few people know about, and
Yeah.
he or she will become publicized 10 years from now. That could happen.
Yeah.
But all of these books are ones that build upon one another. And that's why we speak of a canon of literature. So that, you know, Virgil's Aeneid and Plato's Republic respond to, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey,
Right.
right? And Virgil's probably doing some things where he's responding to Plato's response to Homer, and then we'll get Dante the poet will be responding to things in Virgil and the New Testament and Plato and Homer,
Yeah.
and so the people who sell the great book set, the Britannica people,
Yeah.
they call it the Great Conversation
Yeah.
that happens over the centuries, that you can really think about I don't know, T.S. Eliot and Augustine having a conversation,
Yeah.
right, about a certain topic.
Right.
And so that's kind of the ideal. And we see this across civilizations. We do notice that there are some other traditions of great books that, besides the Western one, we could talk about the ones in the Chinese languages, the Japanese languages, and especially the Sanskrit languages.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a similar pattern there. I mean, a lot of Indian literature is responding in some way or another to one part or another of the Mahabharata.
Yeah.
So those are really the four biggies, right? I mean, it's popular over the ages.
So durability.
It's addressing, essential questions.
Questions.
It's part of a tradition. That was my fourth one, and what was my third one again? I'm losing track.
Yeah.
It's rereadable.
Oh, okay. You can read it again.
You can read it multiple times,
and it might be better the second time or third time that you read it.
Yeah, and that point, I mean, in some way, any artifact is like that. You can watch a bad movie like, I don't know, Spaceballs, and you'll feel different about it when you're 15
that was a great movie. What are you
than
talking
when
about?
you're 31. But that's not the kind of I'm returning to it, I'm getting something new thing we're talking about. We're talking about, you realize, if I had studied it more first time around, I could have gotten out more.
Yeah.
Although there's some limitations to that, because I needed some of the wisdom I've gained over the course of my life to realize some of the riches that were there.
Right. More experience, more understanding, and then you go back to it and realize, maybe that author actually understood something that I should have paid attention to earlier.
Right.
So we've mentioned a few of these great books, Plato and Virgil and Dante, these great authors. Is there anything else you'd like to say about why we should study these books? Because I guess where I'm coming from is, we're not just like, Don Quixote trying to, we're not just amassing all these books and, trying to just gain all this knowledge. It's maybe there's something more to it. And I guess sort of where I'm coming from is like books like Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, or even Dante's Divine Comedy. And we read some Tolkien. We read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and some things like that.
Yeah.
In my mind, where I'm coming from, these are books, they're also great books because by engaging with these authors who are great authors, they help you become a better person. Is that maybe something that you find, or how would you respond to that?
Yeah. So, I mean, we talked about in kind of the, what is the meaning of life questions, but and you can hear from my tone that I'm used to kind of referring to that phrase in kind of a dismissive way. What is the meaning of life? I have images of some, lazy, long-haired, college student sitting in a, college stairwell.
Okay.
What is your philosophy of life, kind of thing? So it sometimes has a bad reputation, but if you think about it, it's really a super practical question. I mean, what is the end of your life? What's the purpose of your living? And in many ways, that's a question of human flourishing, or a question about what's the right way to live.
Right.
And so that can be a question of kind of ethics, kind of to some degree defined by certain rules or by certain guidelines. But it also becomes a question of what are the greatest models of human life? So, with the epic literature, we get the models of the heroes.
Right.
And then with, philosophical dialogues, particularly when they're recounting the life of Socrates, it's the kind of the model of the philosophical life. We We could talk about the model of the saint or the religious holy man.
And Odysseus is better than Achilles, just
Okay.
right. I mean,
Yeah, I
yeah,
think so. I
yeah.
think he's a better model for us, just because, well, for a number of reasons.
uh,
But I mean,
those archetypes.
those archetypes. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I mean, measuring your life up against theirs can be a useful exercise. It can help you think about what it is you really believe. And, in the laws, this is a dialogue by Plato. Um, I think it's in the laws. Maybe it's in the Crazy Critias. Not anyway. The point is that someone says, "Oh, we've devised this ideal of the perfect Athens. Now let's see how it does, in life when it faces when it faces a conflict." And so I do think that one of the things that you can learn, particularly from literature, good literature, and history, is how do your ideals, particularly your ethical ideals, and your conception of what a good life is, how does it handle change? How does it handle conflict? How does it handle the possibility of tragedy in human life? Where for some reason your good qualities are leading you or those you love into a tragic situation. A literature can really, and again, history can really help you think about that.
Right.
Sometimes I think if we study a lot of ethics, um, I don't. I certainly recommend it. One of my very top favorite great books is Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and I really also enjoy the kind of Thomistic Catholic, you could say, deepening of Aristotelian teachings. Um, but those works can kind of sometimes make you think that you can figure out all the rules and then do well. And I think other works are designed to show you that that's really not the case, and so I think having a broader diet of great books gives you is a way of improving yourself that's maybe better than just kind of learning, I don't know, 14 habits of highly effective people who have been influenced by the Stoics.
Yeah. Or if I can just practice wisdom, courage, wisdom, moderation, and prudence every day, that
Right.
I'll become this kind of person.
And that's probably true. I mean, one other thing to say is that um, there's a argument to be made that good books are just as important as great books for training in moral virtue and for training in schools. Books that hold up sensible, ethics and ideals can be really salutary for kids, teenagers, and even adults. And especially if incorporated with a serious, religious tradition. So there is a case for books that maybe, I don't know, you kind of have their main teachings sussed out after a reading or two. So maybe it doesn't count as a great book, but it's I think it's part of human life, right? What can you learn from the person who isn't an amazing artist or wise man? Are you just going to dismiss this person as someone you can't learn from? I mean, there's no doubt that the great books have a kind of elitist, idealist.
Yeah.
We're striving to be at the feet of the greatest philosophers, the greatest poets, the greatest historians.
Yeah.
But I think a sensible person that's influenced by the great books can see the value in learning from more pedestrian things.
Yeah.
And there's other there are genuine dangers in the study of the great books that we might talk about later. So
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and to your last point, I think we even saw that a little bit in our conversations about Dostoevsky's The Idiot, and what I think even the great authors were aware of that principle that you were just talking about, that it's not just the elite greats, the artists or the poets or maybe the heroes that we can learn from, but from all kinds of characters.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, obviously people like Shakespeare.
Right.
I would put Dante in that category too, or obviously Plato, obviously as well. There,
But I think it's
yeah,
it's very vivid in Shakespeare and even more so in Dante,
uh,
because there's all these people that aren't terribly well known,
yeah,
um, that are regarded as having some kind of important, lesson.
right,
I also like there's an incident in Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man where our narrator has just arrived in Harlem, and he meets this kind of crazy street character called I guess you label him the Yam Man because he's selling yams,
okay,
hot buttered yams,
yeah,
and he kind of just lays some street proverbs on the anonymous narrator character,
yeah,
and he really, in a sense, that's kind of a channel for, you might say, Afro-American folk wisdom that's kind of coming to our character at a good time. So, yeah, I'm not saying. The question, I guess, would be if the great books are not going to be your educational ideal, what would it be? And I can imagine some courses of study structured around the idea of good books and structured around the idea of the correct church teachings, right? But I don't really. I mean, I think at some point, most people do have that thirst for something higher. Aristotle says all men by nature desire to know.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's just wanting to know trivia. There's I think all of us, when we're really into a particular area, there's something in us that maybe pushes us to go for the deepest stuff in that particular subject.
Right.
So I don't know. I feel maybe like I'm getting a little in a blathering mode here, but I do think I do think there can be some legitimate criticisms of kind of a focus on the great books and reading all the great books and becoming, modeling yourself after a Dante or a Dostoevsky. But I think those legitimate criticisms can be answered as well.
Sure. And to that point, I agree with you, and it seems like there's, as Aristotle said, all men by nature desire to know. It also seems to me that there's something within us that resists mediocrity.
Right. That's what I was. Yeah, say more.
Yeah, so naturally, human beings, as much as, we want to know, but we also, we respond to things that are great.
Yes.
And there's a reason for that.
Yes. Greatness is very democratic in that sense, or a thirst for greatness or a love for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's democratic, but it's also not. And we can talk about that in some other conversations. So we've mentioned quite a few of these books, but what would you say are maybe a few of your top three of, I know it's really hard to do that.
Yeah, top three. Wow.
Top three of your great books.
Okay, so we're excluding, like the sacred scripture, the Bible, obviously here. That's its kind of its own category.
Right, yeah.
The three that kind of haunt me the most, I think, are, I already mentioned this, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. It's just a very good philosophical elaboration of the common sense approach to ethics.
Yeah.
Yes, from a pagan perspective, but as Aquinas showed, very open to biblical additions or deepenings.
Right.
Second would be probably Pascal's Pensées.
Okay.
Just gives a very potent kind of argument for Christian faith and a kind of warning against believing that you can become too wise or too happy or figure everything out. And then I guess third would be probably Plato's Republic, or probably.
Okay.
This is terrible because I've excluded Tocqueville, which is I've excluded a lot of people. But
I gave you top three, so it's hard. It's really hard to.
Yeah, but those are three that I continually, there's things in them that I continually reflect on and wrestle with.
Yeah. So these are obviously more ancient authors. Who would you say, and this is another very difficult
Mm-hmm.
question, who would you say are contemporary authors? You mentioned Adler, but
Mm-hmm.
and we've talked about Strauss, but who are some contemporary authors that have influenced the way you approach the great books?
So there's authors that are more academic that kind of either presuppose knowledge of great books or push you into learning about them.
Uh-huh.
So, I mean, one of my favorites was a person I wrote with when we did the original postmodern conservative blog, Peter Lawler or Peter Augustine Lawler.
Okay.
Um, so his books are written at a fairly high level,
Yeah.
and they mention lots of different great books, but they're very wise. You and I have been talking about this couple, Benjamin and Jenna Story,
Oh yeah.
and their book Why We Are Restless. That's a good model of contemporary academics taking you through summary accounts of great authors, in this case Montaigne, Pascal, Rousseau, and Tocqueville,
Yeah.
and allowing you to see why their thought could be important to your own living of your own life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that's maybe a different question from, well, who do you think are the great philosophers
Right.
or theologians or literary artists of our time? And that's really tough because the 20th and 19th century just gets harder to choose the great books because you get a greater melding of world cultures and you get just an explosion of literary production. There's
Mm-hmm.
a ton more books out there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, I don't. We're also in a weird period because it seems like from about 1970 forward, maybe you could peg it a little bit earlier. There's been a kind of decline in literature, um, in film. The
Mm-hmm.
film decline doesn't really get going big time till probably the late 80s.
Uh-huh.
And philosophy works feels like philosophy get really highly specialized too, so
Mm-hmm.
um, it's difficult to name a contemporary philosopher that you would say has the weight of a Heidegger or a Kant or
Uh-huh.
a David Hume.
Yeah.
That's I mean, people in those particular areas could maybe steer you better. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
can say that. I'll just mention two literary artists that I keep going back to. I mentioned one of them already,
Oh.
Ralph Ellison,
Uh-huh.
and then Bob Dylan. Strangely enough, I mean,
Uh-huh.
I don't. There's a lot there, and I like Bob too because he sends me back to other writers and allows me to discover their work. So I probably have read more, T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound as a result of trying to figure out things in Bob Dylan
Oh, okay.
songs. So
Interesting.
yeah. So I don't know. There eventually there will be better answers to this kind of question. I think as the
Mm-hmm.
21st century evolves, people will
Mm-hmm.
realize that we're in kind of a trench right now, at a lower point,
Right.
and there'll maybe be more room for realizing some great artists or some great thinkers.
Yeah.
I also mention one political philosopher in our time who I think is genuinely great, and that's Pierre Menant.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he's doing a modern equivalent of what, say, an Aristotle did with political philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
You've mentioned Leo Strauss,
Yeah.
and that's almost a special case,
Yeah.
but yeah, one of the very greatest minds of the 20th century, maybe just the most, and certainly the one who kind of really schooled us on the importance of careful reading.
Yeah.
And it's not that we didn't have other guides for that, but in a complicated way, he showed that a lot of the top political philosophers, a lot of the classical authors, were much more careful in the construction of text than we had thought. There's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of esoteric writing
Yeah.
that had happened and so a lot of good things have been influenced by his example.
Right. Yeah, I think even this conversation we're having, I wonder, I mean, without Leo Strauss, there wouldn't, well, I don't know what would have happened, but there might not have been these same programs of study or approaching the great books in the same way. Maybe Mortimer Adler would have, you know, gotten us
Yeah.
to read the great books, but
Well, I do think that's accurate that people like Adler, and we could also put in Robert Hutchins, there's a number of other important names that we could mention here. In a way, we're already pushing for the great books ideal before Strauss's impact. That his impact doesn't really start till somewhere in the late 50s, early 60s.
mm-hmm.
And you already had, the St. John's colleges in operation by that point.
Yeah.
Some important works by Adler had already been written, and others. I mean, I think direct your readers to another podcast. There's an academic friend of mine, my co-author of the totalitarianism in film book, Flag Taylor at Skidmore College. He has a podcast series called Enduring Interest. Okay. And I don't think it's on YouTube, but you look around, you can find it. Flag Taylor, Enduring Interest. And he goes through a number of thinkers on the great kind of liberal education, great books. Mm-hmm. Strauss is in there, but so are people like Eva Braun, Hannah Arendt, mm-hmm. And I'm forgetting some of the others. Mm-hmm. I think that we would have had an impetus towards great book study without Strauss, mm-hmm. but he certainly gave it more urgency and more excellence than it would have had without his impact.
For sure. And for our listeners and who have never heard of Leo Strauss or Pierre Menot or Eva Braun or any of these people, you can still appreciate. I mean, these are people who have helped us in our approach to the great books. But you can still read Aristotle, or you can still read, Ralph Ellison. You can still read, Plato's Republic.
I mean, the claim. I mean, one claim for the great books is any of these authors, if you really are serious, you read it carefully, and this probably requires you to read it with a small group. You will begin to see some of the larger teachings that are there, mm-hmm. and these will have a beneficial impact on you.
Yeah.
I mean, usually.
Usually.
I mean, if you start there's the classic problems of if you become obsessed with studying Machiavelli or Nietzsche, there's probably some bad reasons for that obsession, and you'll probably get led astray.
And you got to balance it out. Read some Aristotle, to read some Dante, and can't just get especially
I mean we've I don't think we've read Machiavelli in the book in our group, but we have done some Nietzsche, and he was a very serious classic scholar, so there's a lot to learn from him.
Yeah, but we've read Jane Austen. Here's a list of books that we've read in the Provo Great Books Club. I think we've actually read more than these, but I've have a list here of 60 books that we've read.
Mm-hmm. What were your favorites?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I already coming into the Great Books Club, some time ago, I had been thinking of a way of doing just what we're doing. I wanted to get together with my friends who cared about truth and, goodness and virtue, and really passionate about learning. I wanted to get together with friends and talk about these things. And so I had the idea of forming a club where we'd read great books, or we'd take a topic. I remember I started off with, I think Avicenna, something from.
Oh wow!
Yeah, because it was at a time when I was particularly into the medieval Muslim philosophy, and I thought there's got to be something in there that we really need to know about, especially because maybe it's because I'd heard of Strauss, on Maimonides and the Islamic philosophers. So I thought there's got to be something in here that some gold that's hidden deep in there that we need to. So I wanted to start out with that. It never really got going, but once I found the Provo Great Books Club, I was like, okay, yeah, this is what I was trying to do. And so, but I already came to the Provo Great Books Club with some great books that had already influenced me, especially Dante, because I served as a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in southern Italy, and learned Italian, and all things Italian had just been a big part of my life. And as an undergraduate, when I studied Dante, it was just, maybe a little bit of an unhealthy obsession. At least it wasn't Machiavelli or Nietzsche, but just Dante was the greatest. It was just great. So I came to it already with that.
Yeah.
But then my experience at Hillsdale College, we got to read a lot of these great books.
That's true. You got some Hillsdale education.
So that my undergraduate education at BYU was in comparative literature, and so I had even gone there in the hopes of finding a liberal arts education and being able to immerse myself in the great books. And to some extent we did. We read the Homer, and we read Virgil and Dante and Plato, and so to some extent we did get into it. But to answer your question, some of my favorites that we've read, I'm always, besides scripture, I always have Shakespeare and Dante, at the next level down, but still very great. And then, I don't know, looking at this list here,
or put it this way, what did you really like that you were maybe a little surprised that you liked so much?
Oh, okay, yeah. That's a good question.
For me, I think the answer there's got to be Dostoevsky.
Oh, really?
I really didn't know Dostoevsky much, and so I've just really enjoyed our forays into his works.
Okay, yeah, I'd read Brothers Karamazov right after I graduated and just really enjoyed that, and I'd read Crime and Punishment before that, and already was a fan of Dante or of Dostoevsky, but I think all of them are. I already came into it thinking I don't know if I was so much surprised as, okay, one that I really loved was Milton's Paradise Lost. I had never read it. I knew I was gonna like it,
right?
But it was great, and it was even better than I thought. Also, Virgil, I would say maybe I was surprised with the Aeneid, because I had read it before, but I think I read it again and got more out of it the second time.
Yeah.
And realized there's a lot more going on here than I previously supposed. But I'll just read a couple of there's six. I'll post a link to this so you can see the books that we've read. Oh, here's one, George Eliot's Middlemarch.
Oh yeah.
I had never read it, or I'd heard of a friend who read it, and he's kind of a super smart guy who can read, really fat books, and I just thought, I don't think I'm never gonna read George Eliot's Middlemarch, but that was a really great book. I really enjoyed it. Yeah. So maybe that's one. How about for you?
The Dostoevsky.
Right.
Gosh, let's see. I really enjoyed reading Nietzsche, Birth of Tragedy sparked a lot of cool ideas for me.
Okay.
Thinking about the history of Greek drama. I really did enjoy. We just did right now we just finished Dostoevsky, The Idiot. Before that, we did the Odyssey, and I've always loved the Odyssey, but I'm not really. I think because I had the luxury of reading some good commentaries alongside it, I really enjoyed that a lot. Just saw a lot more riches in Homer and could see why people would dedicate themselves to the study of Homer.
Yeah.
Um, so those are a few of my examples. Oh, also I think Aquinas. So
Oh yeah. On the
when
Soul.
we did On the Soul, or we did Aristotle On the Soul, and then we did Aquinas. I mean, at first it was so hard. Some of those readings were really hard,
Uh-huh.
but if you got through them,
Uh-huh.
you really felt like you had, digested something significant
Yeah.
and opened your mind to some good philosophical and at times theological thinking.
Yeah. Are there any of these books that you think were paradigm shifting in a way? For me, I'll say I hadn't read much Tocqueville. Even, I mean, strangely enough, even at Hillsdale College, it was on the list of, it was part of the curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow I wasn't directed toward that. And anyway, there were some funny comments
Yeah.
about Tocqueville, um, because he's not American. But for me, that's one thing I love about the great books and great authors is that you, for me, Tocqueville is one of those authors that opened up new horizons.
Good. Good.
So
Yeah. Well, we actually didn't do that with the group. You and
yeah,
I studied that as kind of a special
right,
study, but it does point to the fact that one problem with undergraduate education is that often professors are rushed. They
yeah,
cram more than they should. I've been guilty of this myself, more than they should in a
yeah,
syllabus, and so I got to put Tocqueville in there,
yeah,
and so you get like the best of Tocqueville's Democracy in America crammed into maybe 4 sessions, 2 weeks, and okay, you can definitely realize the man's riches
yeah.
and learn maybe a couple ideas. Maybe you'll come away with tyranny of the majority and
Uh,
you know, I don't know, some other Tocquevillian idea.
you're not going to get the mother thought just from that.
but really, that's the work we're talking about here is democracy in America, and you're just not going to really get the main teachings if you don't try to grapple with a good. It's not necessary to read the whole thing. You could get away with reading 80 to 70 to 60% of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, without a kind of systematic going through it, seeing the flow, it's just not going to hit you in the same way. And that's, we could say that about quite a few works. A lot of colleges are doing the thing of kind of throwing, a little bit of Shakespeare, they kind of have to give you the whole play, but they'll give you a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and they won't give you the full experience of one of these authors. They'll have you read 2 chapters of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and then they'll say, "Oh, we taught you Ellison," which is just preposterous, really. So I don't know. I'm starting to talk like a a nagging professor, so I won't. But I do think that our colleges are coming up short in a number of ways, and definitely one of them is they're not really acquainting students enough with enough of the books of this great books canon. It's not the case that you are not an educated person if you haven't read half of Shakespeare's plays, or you're not an educated person if you haven't read Dante. No, you can be an educated person and have pretty large gaps, but if you've got no exposure to great literature, if you've never seen the connections between a Homer and a Virgil, or you can't substitute that with the connections between a Milton and a Shelley, you really are lacking quite a bit, and that your areas of ignorance are bigger than you think they are, and they're causing more confusion for you than you might expect, because what's happening to you is you're just kind of taking in whatever is flowing in the culture and the internet at the moment, and you don't have the kind of wisdom of these sages, some philosophic, some poetic, some more history, politics based, that can inoculate you from really bad errors and just give you a different perspective.
Yeah.
You know.
For me, Tocqueville is one of those authors who who really shows he helps you to understand where we are now and how we got here. Kind of situate yourself in this great conversation that you've been telling us about. So there has been this great conversation that's been going on, and some might say, Plato kind of started it, but there's been this great conversation, and wherever you insert yourself in that conversation is good, a good starting point. But if you don't have any clue about any of that conversation, then it's hard, I think, to even situate yourself where we are in, like the title of your blog, postmodern conservative. Like, what on earth is a postmodern conservative? How would you even know what that is?
Well, that's actually a title that comes from Peter, and I might choose something different if it was up to me. But I mean, one thing you can do is I've mentioned that there's some debate about where the canon, how to define it once you get to about the 19th century, and then the whole question of kind of world literature. What do you do with the questions it raises is another kind of. But I would argue that there's more agreement about what the great books really are in the Western canon than you might think. And you could go to the St. John's College website. You can find their lists of the books they use. Another fine Great Books College, but one that's run from a Roman Catholic perspective, is Thomas Aquinas. You could look at what they're doing. Again, there's this particular book, Mortimer Adler. There's probably stuff online where you can look up. I mean, Adler kind of became the spokesperson for the Britannica Corporation when they were selling two big book sets. This was in the 50s and 60s particularly. The encyclopedia and the Great Books set. So that set by itself, so I'm sure there's internet resources with Britannica where you could look up. And then I should also just say that our club tries to recruit maybe from the Wasatch Front area. We're trying to stay mainly local, although we have some members that are far afield that meet with us on internet. Look, you could respond in the comments to this video, or if you're interested and learn more about what we're doing. And if you're elsewhere or whatever, you might just want to think about doing this on your own. I mean, it's all you really need is a core. If you get up to about 3 to 4 people who can be dedicated, you're a long way to being to the finish line of making this work. So that's some practical advice for how what we've done and had success with is something you could do as well.
Great. Thank you, Carl. Is there anything else you'd like to say about the Great Books or Provo Great Books Club? I mean, it's obviously, like you said, it's local. We do have some members kind of scattered throughout. We've had people join us from California and Indiana, but yeah, maybe it's more practical to start your own little chapter somewhere. And
yeah, I mean, I'm happy if people join us and we get too many members, we'll split the group in two and do it that way.
Yeah.
So we're very much open. At this point, most of our people are kind of 30s or 40s, but again, when we started, it was more college age students, and we're open. We've had elderly members, and as I've said, we're open to having younger members too.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to visit and to share all about the Provo Great Books Club, and I hope that we can have more conversations about related topics in the future.
Okay, thanks, John.
Thanks.
Yeah.